Chapter 1. The Whispering Pines. The pre-dawn fog rolled through the valley of Silver Peak like a living thing, wrapping around the towering spruce trees that had stood sentinel for 1,000 years. Isla Ravencroft moved silently along the boundary between the village commons and the forbidden Alpha's territory, her woven basket already half filled with the medicinal plants that were her trade. At 23, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Her father's disgrace 5 years ago had taught her that lesson well. How to keep her head down, her voice soft, her presence unremarkable. The thick braid of copper-red hair that fell past her shoulders was the only vibrant thing about her, and even that she kept covered beneath a hood of rough-spun wool. The boundary stones were ancient, carved with runes that predated the current pack's rule. Isla kept carefully to the permitted side as her trained eye searched for yarrow, feverfew, and the rare nightshade that grew in the shadow of the great trees. These plants were her livelihood, the only inheritance from her mother, who had died bringing her into this world. The scent of wet earth and pine resin filled her lungs as she knelt beside a moss-covered boulder where she'd spotted wild sage growing thick and healthy. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, harvesting the leaves while leaving the roots intact for future growth. The early morning light was just beginning to filter through the canopy, casting long shadows across her work. Isla's gray-green eyes, the color of storm clouds over the sea, remained focused on her task. She had learned long ago that survival meant attention to detail, that a moment's carelessness could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. The village apothecary paid her fairly for her gatherings, but it was barely enough to keep her tiny cottage maintained and food on her table. That's when she heard it, a sound that turned her blood to ice water, a low, agonized howl that seemed to come from deep within the Alpha's forest. It was a sound of such raw suffering that it bypassed her mind entirely and went straight to something primal in her chest. Isla's hands stilled on the sage. She knew that sound. She'd heard it once before, when old Marcus the shepherd had been gored by a wild boar and left to die slowly in the fields. But this was no human sound. This came from something powerful, something wild. She rose slowly, her basket forgotten. The howling came again, weaker now, followed by high-pitched whimpers that could only be described as desperate. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to gather her things and flee back to the safety of the village. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, harsh and unforgiving. "The Alpha's lands are sacred, Isla. Cross that boundary and face judgment. There is no mercy for trespassers in Silver Peak." Yet even as the warning rang in her mind, Isla found herself moving forward, drawn by an invisible thread of compassion that had always been both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. The sounds were fading. Whatever creature made them was dying. She pushed through a curtain of hanging branches and found herself on a narrow game trail that wound deeper into the forbidden woods. The air grew colder here, heavy with the scent of blood and something else, something that made the mark on her inner wrist pulse with sudden heat. Isla had always kept that mark hidden, a crescent moon surrounded by 3 stars that she'd been born with. Her father had called it a blessing from the moon goddess. The village elders had called it a mark of power. Isla had simply called it a burden, one more thing that made her different, dangerous, other. The trail opened into a small clearing, and Isla stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. A massive silver wolf lay motionless beside an uprooted tree, her coat matted with blood that looked black in the dim light. This was no ordinary wolf. Even in death, the creature radiated a presence that spoke of ancient bloodlines and noble heritage. This was one of the Alpha's prize breeding wolves, the ones said to be descended from the first shifters themselves. But it was the 4 tiny shapes huddled against the wolf's cooling body that made Isla's heart clench with grief. Pups, newborn by the look of them, their eyes still sealed shut, their small bodies shivering violently with cold and weakness. One was pure white, another charcoal gray, a third was russet brown, and the smallest was black with distinctive silver markings along its spine. They were dying. Isla dropped to her knees beside them, her hands hovering uncertainly over the tiny forms. They were barely breathing, their small chests rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. Without their mother's warmth and milk, they wouldn't survive another hour in this cold. The sound of horses on stone made Isla's head snap up in terror. Through the trees, she could see a flash of white and the gleam of expensive leather. Someone was coming this way. Someone who had every right to be in these woods while Isla most certainly did not. "Please," Isla whispered desperately, though she didn't know who she was pleading with. "Please, I need help." A rider emerged from the mist, and Isla felt her stomach drop. Lady Seraphina Nightshade sat astride a magnificent white stallion, her silver blonde hair arranged in elaborate braids that must have taken hours to perfect. At 27, she possessed the kind of cold, sharp beauty that belonged in ice sculptures. All angles and pale perfection. Her riding habit was cut from the finest velvet, dyed the deep purple that marked her as beta female of the pack. Behind her rode a group of nobles, their laughter bright and careless in the morning air. They were dressed for pleasure, not purpose, their faces flushed with wine and entertainment. "My lady," Isla called out, her voice breaking with desperation. "Please, I beg your help. The wolf, she's given birth but died in the process. Her pups are freezing. If we don't act now." Seraphina's ice-blue gaze swept over the scene with the interest of someone examining a mildly annoying insect. Her cold eyes lingered on Isla's threadbare dress and mud-stained cloak before moving to the dead wolf and her dying offspring. "Dead animals are beneath my concern," Seraphina said, her voice carrying the crisp diction of high nobility. "I have appointments to keep. The ladies of House Moonwhisper have arranged a breakfast gathering, and I refuse to be late for such important social obligations." "But my lady, they're just infants," Isla pleaded, gesturing toward the pups with shaking hands. "Surely a few moments." "I said no." Seraphina's voice cut through Isla's words like a whip crack. "Find someone else to deal with nature's unfortunate accidents. I have a reputation to maintain." With that, she spurred her horse forward, her entourage following with a rustle of expensive fabric and musical laughter. One of the younger nobles glanced back with what might have been guilt in his eyes, but none of them stopped. Within moments, they had disappeared entirely, leaving Isla alone with the dying pups. "Heartless witch," Isla muttered under her breath, then immediately felt guilty for the harsh words. But as she knelt beside the pups again, watching their small bodies grow weaker by the moment, anger burned hot and bright in her chest. Isla gathered the 4 tiny forms against her chest, trying to share what little warmth she had. Their fur was softer than silk, finer than anything she'd ever touched. But she could feel how thin they were, how their small bones pressed against her palms. They barely stirred at her touch. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "I don't know how to save you." That's when it happened. A strange warmth began to build in her chest, spreading outward through her arms and into her hands. Isla gasped, nearly dropping the pups in surprise. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Like summer sunlight flowing through her veins, like liquid gold poured into her bones. Her hands began to glow with a soft silver light. Isla stared in shock at her own palms, certain she must be hallucinating from grief and fear. But the glow remained, pulsing gently in rhythm with her heartbeat. And beneath her glowing hands, something impossible was happening. The pups' breathing began to deepen and strengthen. Color returned to their tiny noses and paw pads. The smallest one, the black pup with silver markings, let out a tiny yip of protest as strength flowed back into his small body. Isla's father's voice whispered through her memory like a ghost. "The Ravencroft bloodline carries ancient magic, daughter. Gifts from the time when the first shifters walked beneath the moon goddess's blessing. But such gifts come with a terrible price, and the world has grown cruel to those who bear them." As the pups stirred to full, healthy life beneath her touch, Isla finally understood what her father had meant. The old stories hadn't been just tales after all. The mark on her wrist, the one she had always hidden beneath long sleeves, suddenly blazed with silver light that showed through her clothing. Power flowed through her like molten silver, more intoxicating than the strongest mead. But even as she marveled at what she could do, fear wrapped cold fingers around her heart. Magic like this was the stuff of legends. And in Silver Peak, legends had a way of getting their bearers executed. The pups mewed softly, their cries no longer weak with approaching death, but strong with renewed life. Isla held them close, her mind racing. She had to get them to safety, had to find a way to care for them until they could fend for themselves. But how could she explain their sudden recovery? How could she account for their presence without admitting to trespassing in the Alpha's forbidden forest? More importantly, how long would it be before someone noticed that her touch could bring the dying back to life? As Isla carefully tucked the 4 pups into her basket and began the long walk back to her humble cottage, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had changed everything. The silver light had faded from her hands, but she could still feel the power humming beneath her skin, waiting to be called upon again. Behind her, in the gloom of the ancient forest, the body of the mother wolf lay still and cold. But her children lived, their small hearts beating strong and sure against Isla's chest. And somewhere in the capital city, Alpha King Theron Blackthorne was concluding his diplomatic mission to the Eastern Territories, unaware that his prized breeding wolf was dead and her offspring had mysteriously vanished. Isla could only pray that when that moment of discovery came, she would be ready for the consequences. Chapter 2: Silver Awakening. Isla's hands trembled as she pushed open the door to her modest cottage, the 4 wolf pups cradled carefully in her basket. The small dwelling felt even tinier with the weight of her secret pressing down upon her. Stone walls that had once seemed cozy now felt like a trap, and the familiar scent of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams couldn't mask the wild, earthy smell that clung to the pups' fur. The cottage sat at the very edge of the village, where cultivated gardens gave way to wild moorland. It had been her father's home before his execution, and his father's before that. For generations of Ravencroft healers had walked these floors, tended the medicinal garden out back, and kept their family's secrets buried deep beneath ordinary lives. Isla settled the pups on a pile of soft furs near the stone hearth, her heart racing as she watched them stretch and yawn with newborn contentment. They were extraordinary, more extraordinary than any natural wolves she had ever encountered. Their fur held an almost ethereal quality, catching the light in ways that seemed impossible, and their closed eyes seemed to pulse with barely contained power. And they were growing. Even in the short journey from the forest to her cottage, Isla could swear they had grown larger. Their growth seemed accelerated, fueled by the lingering magic in her touch, a phenomenon her father's journals had hinted at, suggesting ancient power could bend the natural laws of time and development. "What have I done?" she whispered, sinking onto the rough wooden bench beside the hearth. The largest pup, the charcoal gray one, stretched and made a small sound of contentment. Isla found herself reaching out to stroke his tiny head, and the moment her fingers made contact with his fur, that strange warmth flowed through her again. The pup's eyes snapped open, revealing irises of startling amber that seemed far too intelligent for a newborn. Isla jerked her hand back, but it was too late. The other 3 pups were stirring as well, their eyes opening to reveal colors that defied nature. The white one's eyes were pale blue, like winter ice under moonlight. The russet pup gazed at her with eyes of deep forest green, and the smallest, the black one with silver markings, looked at her with eyes that matched the silver glow of her healing light. "This isn't possible," Isla breathed. "Wolf pups aren't supposed to open their eyes for weeks." But even as she spoke the words, she knew she was deceiving herself. Nothing about this situation was natural. The power that had flowed through her hands in the forest, the way the dying pups had responded to her touch, the strange heat that now seemed to live beneath her skin. All of it pointed to one terrifying conclusion: magic. Isla rose on unsteady legs and moved to the small chest that sat beneath her single window. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid and pushed aside folded linens to reveal a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Her father's private writings, filled with stories Isla had always hoped were exaggeration rather than truth. She carried the journal back to the fire and opened it with reverence, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting until she found the passage she remembered. "The gift runs through our bloodline like a river runs to the sea," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Each generation, the moon goddess chooses one soul to carry the healing light. But the gift comes with terrible danger, for humans fear what they cannot comprehend, and those in power seek to control what they cannot possess." Isla's fingers moved instinctively to her inner wrist, where beneath her sleeve lay the crescent-shaped mark she had carried since birth. Her father had told her it was a blessing from the moon goddess, a sign of their family's ancient connection to the shifter bloodlines. Now, as she pressed her palm against the mark, she could feel it thrumming with warmth, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. A soft whimper drew her attention back to the pups. The silver-eyed one, the smallest of the 4, was attempting to crawl toward her on legs still too weak to support his weight. Without thinking, Isla reached out and lifted him into her lap. The moment he settled against her, purring like a contented kitten, the mark on her wrist blazed with light so bright it showed through the fabric of her sleeve. The pup's eyes widened, and he made a sound that was almost like recognition. "You know, don't you?" Isla whispered, stroking his soft fur. "You can sense what I am." As if in response, the pup nuzzled against her hand, and Isla felt that incredible warmth flow between them again. But this time, instead of just healing energy, she sensed something else: connection, understanding, as if an invisible thread now bound them together. She looked up to find the other 3 pups watching her with the same intelligent awareness, their unusual eyes bright with unmistakable affection. Whatever her power had done to save their lives, it had also created a bond between them that ran deeper than mere gratitude. "Shadow," she said suddenly, the name rising unbidden from somewhere deep in her heart as she looked at the charcoal gray pup with amber eyes. "And Frost," she continued, her gaze shifting to the white one whose pale blue eyes reminded her of winter mornings. "Ember," she said, looking at the russet pup whose green eyes held the depth of ancient forests. "And you," she whispered, lifting the silver-eyed pup closer to her face, "you're Ash." The names felt right, as if they had always belonged to these creatures. The pups seemed to approve as well, each one responding to their given name with soft sounds of contentment. As the day wore on, Isla watched in amazement as the pups grew visibly stronger and larger. By midday, they were the size of month-old wolves, and by afternoon, they were attempting to stand on legs that should not have supported them for weeks yet. Every time she touched them, Isla could feel her healing power responding, accelerating their natural development in ways that should have been impossible. The magic flowed through her like quicksilver through stone, natural and terrifying and intoxicatingly powerful. It wasn't until the sun began to set that reality crashed back down upon her with crushing force. The sound of a horse's hooves on the cobblestones outside made Isla's blood turn to ice. She rushed to the small window and peered through the thick glass, her heart sinking as she recognized the royal herald's distinctive black and silver livery. The man dismounted from his lathered horse and strode toward the village square, a scroll clutched in his gauntlet hand. Isla could hear his booming voice even from this distance. "By order of His Majesty, Alpha King Theron Blackthorne, all subjects are hereby informed of his imminent return to the Kingdom of Silverpeak. The Alpha arrives at dawn tomorrow, having successfully concluded negotiations with the Eastern Territories." Isla's knees nearly buckled. Dawn tomorrow. That gave her perhaps 12 hours before the Alpha discovered his prized wolf was dead and her pups were missing. 12 hours before guards would be sent to question every villager, to search every cottage, to find any trace of the missing royal wolves. She looked down at the 4 pups, who were now large enough to walk steadily on their own, and were watching her with those unnaturally intelligent eyes. They seemed to sense her distress, whimpering softly and pressing closer to her legs. "What am I going to do with you?" she whispered, her voice thick with fear. As if in answer, Ash, the silver-eyed pup, padded over to the cottage door and scratched at the wooden surface. When Isla didn't immediately respond, he looked back at her and whined, his meaning clear. They wanted to go home. Even as young as they were, some instinct was calling them back to the palace, back to their rightful place at the Alpha's side. But if Isla let them go, if she opened that door and watched them disappear into the night, how would she explain their miraculous recovery? How would she account for their impossible growth and development? More importantly, how long would it be before someone connected their healing to her? Isla sank to the floor beside the pups, burying her face in her hands. The weight of her secret felt like a stone in her chest, growing heavier with each passing moment. She thought of her father's warnings, of the stories passed down through generations of Ravencroft healers about those who had revealed their gifts and paid the ultimate price. Her father had been executed for treason, false charges brought by those who feared his knowledge of the old ways. She had been only 18, helpless to save him, forced to watch as they took his head in the village square. The memory still haunted her dreams. But she also thought of the Alpha returning home to find his beloved wolf dead and her children vanished. The grief that would follow, the rage, the desperate search for answers. How many innocents would suffer before he found the truth? Outside, she could hear the herald's voice growing fainter as he moved through the village, spreading word of the Alpha's return. Soon, everyone would know. Soon, the entire kingdom would be holding its breath, waiting for their ruler's homecoming. And somewhere in a clearing deep in the Alpha's forest, the body of a magnificent silver wolf lay cold and still, while her children grew strong and healthy in the cottage of a woman who had just discovered she possessed power beyond her wildest imaginings. Isla looked down at the pups, who had curled up together in a pile of warm fur, their strange eyes watching her with absolute trust. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever consequences followed, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would protect them with her life. The mark on her wrist pulsed with silver light, as if in agreement, and Isla felt the full weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders like a cloak woven from moonlight and shadow. Chapter 3. The Alpha's Return. Dawn broke gray and cold over the kingdom of Silver Peak, the early morning mist clinging to the palace's ancient towers like ghostly shrouds. Isla had not slept. She sat huddled by her dying fire, watching the 4 wolf pups who had grown even larger during the night. They were now the size of adolescent wolves, their intelligence burning bright in eyes that held too much wisdom for their age. Shadow, the charcoal gray pup with amber eyes, lifted his head at the sound of distant hoofbeats echoing across the valley. His ears pricked forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. The other 3 pups immediately responded, their bodies tensing with what could only be described as longing. They knew. Somehow they knew their true master was returning. Isla's heart hammered against her ribs as she moved to the small window and peered through the thick glass. In the distance, she could see the royal procession winding its way up the mountain road toward the palace. Even from this distance, she could make out the distinctive black banners of the Alpha, snapping proudly in the morning breeze. At the head of the procession rode a figure that commanded attention even at this distance. Tall and powerful, he sat his midnight black war horse with the natural grace of a born predator. Alpha King Theron Blackthorne, 30 years old and the most powerful shifter in all the known realms, had returned to his domain. Isla had only seen him once before, during his coronation ceremony 6 years ago, when every subject in the kingdom had been required to witness his ascension to the throne. Even then, from her place among the common folk far in the back, she had felt the weight of his presence like a physical force. His coal-black hair had gleamed in the sunlight, and his storm-gray eyes had held an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. Now, as she watched him approach his palace, Isla felt that same overwhelming sense of power reaching across the distance. This was not a man to be trifled with. This was not a man who would forgive easily. Behind her, the pups had begun to pace restlessly, their whines growing more urgent by the moment. Ash, the smallest but somehow the most determined, patted to the door and scratched at it insistently. "I know you want to go home," Isla whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But if I let you go now, if they find you healthy and grown when you should be dead, what do you think will happen to me?" Shadow turned his amber gaze upon her, and for a moment, Isla could have sworn she saw understanding there. Not just animal recognition, but something deeper, something almost human. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and Isla realized with growing horror that they were not all heading toward the palace. Some of the riders had broken away from the main procession and were making their way down the mountain toward the village. Isla's blood turned to ice as she recognized the purpose of their mission. The Alpha would want to see his prized breeding wolf immediately upon his return. When he found her body and discovered the missing pups, his first instinct would be to question everyone who lived near the forest, starting with the village healer who had been seen gathering plants in the area just yesterday. "Oh, goddess," Isla breathed, pressing her hands to her mouth. "They're coming here." As if her words had broken some invisible barrier, all 4 pups suddenly bolted for the door. Isla lunged after them, but Shadow was too quick. His powerful paws scrambled against the wooden latch until it lifted, and the door swung open with a crash. "No!" Isla cried out, but it was too late. The 4 young wolves burst from her cottage like arrows from a bow, their muscular bodies moving with a speed and grace that belied their young age. Isla ran after them, her bare feet slipping on the dew-wet grass, but they were already disappearing into the forest that bordered her small garden. They were going home, going back to the master they had never truly known but somehow recognized in their very bones. Isla stood in her doorway, gasping for breath and watching the last flash of russet fur disappear between the trees. Part of her felt relief. The dangerous secret was out of her hands now. Whatever happened next, she could not be blamed for keeping the Alpha's wolves from him. But another part of her, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, felt as though her heart was being torn from her chest. In the span of a single day and night, Those 4 magnificent creatures had become more than just animals she had saved. They had become family. The hoofbeats were getting closer now, and Isla forced herself to move. She had perhaps minutes before the Alpha's guards reached her cottage. Minutes to hide any evidence of what had truly transpired in the royal forest. She rushed back inside and quickly gathered up the furs where the pups had slept, shaking them out and hanging them back on their pegs as though nothing had happened. She swept the floor where muddy paw prints had marked their passage, and threw the last of her precious firewood onto the dying embers to mask any lingering scent. But even as she worked, Isla knew it was futile. Any shifter with half their natural senses intact would smell the wolves the moment they entered her cottage. The question was whether they would recognize the scent as belonging to the Alpha's missing pups, or simply assume she had encountered wild wolves during her herb gathering. A thunderous pounding on her door made her heart leap into her throat. She smoothed her hair with trembling hands and opened the door to find herself facing 4 of the Alpha's elite guard. They were massive men, all of them bearing the distinctive black and silver of the royal house. Their leader, a battle-scarred warrior with a shaved head and cold blue eyes, stepped forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Isla Ravencroft. His voice was rough as gravel, and his pale eyes missed nothing as they swept over her appearance. "You are to come with us immediately. The Alpha King requires your presence." "Yes, sir," Isla managed, proud that her voice didn't shake. "May I ask why?" "There has been an incident in the royal forest," the guard replied, his expression unreadable. "We're questioning all villagers who were seen in the area yesterday." His nostrils flared slightly as he caught the scent emanating from her cottage. "You will come now." It wasn't a request. Isla nodded mutely and reached for her cloak, but the guard caught her wrist in a grip that was just shy of painful. "No cloak," he said quietly. "No delays. The Alpha is not in a patient mood this morning." They escorted her through the village, and Isla was mortified to see curious faces peering from windows and doorways. By evening, everyone would know that Isla Ravencroft had been taken to the palace by the Alpha's guard. The whispers would start immediately, and they would only grow louder with time. The ride to the palace seemed to take an eternity, though Isla knew it could not have been more than an hour. She sat rigidly behind the scarred guard on his massive war horse, trying to ignore the knowing looks of the other guards, and the way they kept glancing at her as though they could smell secrets on her skin. When they finally reached the palace gates, Isla's courage nearly deserted her entirely. The ancient fortress rose above them like something from a nightmare. All black stone and sharp angles, its towers reaching toward the sky like grasping claws. This was a place built for war, not comfort, and everything about it spoke of power and domination. They led her through corridors lined with tapestries depicting great hunts and famous battles, past rooms filled with weapons and armor, upstairs worn smooth by countless feet. Isla had never been inside the palace before, and she found herself overwhelmed by the sheer size and grandeur of it all. Finally, they stopped before massive oak doors bound with iron. The scarred guard knocked once, and a voice from within called for them to enter. Isla stepped into the Alpha's private chambers and immediately felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. The room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace, its flames casting dancing shadows across walls lined with books and ancient maps. Weapons of every kind hung from hooks, and the scent of leather and pine smoke filled the air. But it was the man standing with his back to her, staring into the fire, who made Isla's world tilt on its axis. Alpha King Theron Blackthorne was even more imposing up close than she had imagined. He stood well over 6.5 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling out a black leather jerkin that had clearly been tailored to accommodate his powerful frame. His coal-black hair fell past his collar, and when he turned to face her, Isla nearly gasped aloud. His eyes were not merely gray. They were the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, holding a depth of emotion that took her breath away. Grief, rage, and something else, something that made her skin tingle with awareness. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, only adding to his fierce beauty. And when his gaze locked with hers, Isla felt as though the world had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. "Your Majesty," she managed, dropping into the deepest curtsy she could manage. "Rise," he commanded, and his voice was exactly as she remembered from his coronation, deep and rich, with an undertone of absolute authority that made every instinct in her body scream submission. Isla straightened, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. But she could feel his gaze burning into her like a brand. "Tell me, Isla Ravencroft," the Alpha said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made her shiver. "What did you see in my forest yesterday?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade, and Isla knew that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of the four magnificent creatures she had saved and grown to love. Taking a deep breath, she looked up and met the Alpha's impossible storm-gray gaze. "Everything, Your Majesty," she whispered. "I saw everything." Chapter 4, Judgment's Hour. The great hall of Silverpeak Palace had been transformed into a court of judgment, its soaring stone walls echoing with whispered conversations as nobles in their finest silks gathered to witness what promised to be an extraordinary trial. Torches blazed in iron sconces, casting flickering shadows across ancient tapestries that depicted the kingdom's most legendary battles and hunts. Isla stood in the center of it all, her simple brown dress a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. Her wrists were bound with iron shackles that felt heavier than they should, and she could feel every eye in the room boring into her, as though they could strip away her secrets by will alone. At the head of the hall, Alpha King Theron sat upon his throne of black oak and iron, his presence dominating the vast space even in stillness. He had changed from his traveling clothes into formal court attire, a doublet of deep midnight blue that made his storm-gray eyes seem even more intense. The crown of Silverpeak, wrought from iron and set with obsidian stones, caught the torchlight and cast sharp shadows across his angular features. To his right sat Lady Seraphina Nightshade, resplendent in a gown of ice-blue silk that matched her calculating eyes perfectly. Her silver-blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate style befitting her position as beta female, and sapphires glittered at her throat like captured starlight. She watched the proceedings with the cold interest of a predator studying wounded prey. Isla's heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered their encounter in the forest, remembered the cruel dismissal, the casual cruelty. Now Seraphina held the power to spin whatever narrative she chose, and Isla knew with sickening certainty that truth would not be her ally in this place. "Bring forth the accused," commanded the court herald, his voice booming through the hall. The scarred guard stepped forward, his shaved head gleaming in the torchlight. "Your Majesty, we present Isla Ravencroft, age 23, village healer. She was found in possession of knowledge regarding the incident in the royal forest." Theron leaned forward slightly, his storm-gray gaze fixed upon Isla with an intensity that made her skin burn. "Tell the court what you told me in my chambers, Miss Ravencroft. Leave nothing out." Isla lifted her chin, drawing upon reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Her voice rang clear and strong through the great hall as she began her tale. "I was gathering medicinal plants at the boundary of the royal forest when I heard sounds of distress from deeper within the forbidden territory. Against all wisdom, I followed them and found a silver wolf, one of great beauty and obvious noble breeding, who had died during childbirth. Her 4 pups were dying in the cold." Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Isla continued, her gray-green eyes never leaving the Alpha's face. "I encountered Lady Seraphina and her riding party. I begged for assistance, explaining that without immediate help, the pups would perish within the hour." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "Lady Seraphina informed me that dead animals were no concern of hers, and that she had more pressing social engagements to attend. She rode away and left them to die." The murmurs turned to gasps, and Isla saw several nobles turn to stare at Seraphina with expressions of shock. But the beta female's face remained a mask of serene indifference, as though Isla were discussing the weather rather than the death of the Alpha's most prized breeding wolf. Seraphina rose gracefully from her seat, her voice carrying the cultured tones of nobility as she addressed the court. "Your Majesty, I must protest this common woman's attempt to malign my character with such outrageous fabrications. I was never approached by this person, nor did I encounter any distressed animals during my morning ride. She seeks to deflect blame for her own crimes by creating elaborate lies." Isla's hands clenched into fists within her shackles. "I speak the truth, Your Majesty. I can describe every detail of Lady Seraphina's attire that morning, her companions, even the white stallion she rode." "Details easily observed from hiding," Seraphina replied smoothly, her ice-blue eyes glittering with malice. "This woman was clearly lurking in the forest with ill intent. Perhaps she killed poor Luna herself, hoping to steal the pups for some dark purpose." The accusation hit Isla like a physical blow. Around the hall, she could see nobles nodding in agreement, their faces hardening with suspicion and disgust. Who were they to believe? A beta female of noble blood, or a common village girl with the stain of her father's execution still clinging to her name? But then Alpha King Theron rose from his throne, and the entire hall fell silent as death. Enough! His voice cut through the murmurs like a blade through silk. His storm-gray eyes swept the assembled court before settling on Isla once more. You claim to have found my pups dying. Yet when my guards searched the area around your cottage this morning, they found evidence of healthy wolves. The scent was unmistakable. How do you explain this discrepancy? This was the moment Isla had dreaded most. The moment when she would have to choose between her own life and the truth of what she had become. She thought of her father's warnings, of the generations of Ravencroft healers who had hidden their gifts to survive. Then she thought of Shadow, Frost, Ember, and Ash growing strong and healthy because of her touch. She thought of the silver light that had flowed through her hands, the impossible warmth that had brought them back from the brink of death. Some truths were worth dying for. They were healthy because I saved them, Your Majesty, Isla said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed hall. I have been blessed by the moon goddess with the gift of healing. The silence that followed was deafening. Then someone in the crowd whispered the word that Isla had feared most of her life. Witch. The word spread through the hall like wildfire. Nobles pressed back against the walls, making signs against evil. Several called for her immediate execution, their voices rising in a crescendo of fear and hatred. But Isla kept her eyes fixed on the Alpha, watching as emotions warred across his stern features. Disbelief, calculation, and something else, something that made her pulse quicken despite the mortal danger she faced. Prove it, Theron commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. The hall fell silent once more as all eyes turned to Isla. She looked around desperately, searching for some way to demonstrate her power without revealing its true magnitude. Her gaze fell upon an elderly servant who stood near one of the columns, his gnarled hands wrapped around a walking stick. The man was clearly in pain, his posture twisted from years of bearing heavy burdens. You there, Isla said, nodding toward him. Sir, would you approach? The servant looked to the Alpha, who gave a curt nod. The old man hobbled forward, his limp pronounced and clearly agonizing with each step. What is your name, sir? Isla asked gently. Gareth, miss. Gareth of the Palace Guard, retired these 15 years past. Isla could see the pain etched in every line of his weathered face, could smell the poultices he used to dull the constant ache in his joints. Your back troubles you greatly, does it not? Gareth nodded, confusion clear in his watery eyes. I, miss. Took a fall from the battlements in the Alpha's service long ago. Never healed proper, it didn't. May I? Isla held up her shackled hands. The old man glanced at the Alpha, who watched with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. At Theron's slight nod, Gareth turned his back to Isla. Isla placed her bound hands against Gareth's spine, just below where she knew the old injury must lie. The familiar warmth began to build in her chest, spreading down through her arms and into her hands. Silver light began to seep between her fingers, soft at first, then growing stronger. The mark on her wrist blazed beneath her sleeve, and Isla felt the familiar rush of power as her gift responded to the old man's need. Gareth's eyes widened in shock as the light engulfed his back. Isla felt the familiar rush of power, scar tissue softening and dissolving, damaged vertebrae realigning themselves, old pain that had lived in Gareth's bones for decades simply melting away like frost in spring sunshine. Isla pulled her hands back, and Gareth stared down at himself in wonder. Tentatively, he straightened his spine, fully straightened it for the first time in 15 years. Then he took a step without his walking stick. Then another. The twisted posture that had defined his gait for so long was completely gone. Blessed moon goddess, Gareth breathed, tears streaming down his cheeks. I can stand straight. I can move without pain for the first time in decades. The great hall erupted in chaos. Some nobles fell to their knees in religious awe, while others backed toward the exits in terror. Arguments broke out between those who saw Isla as blessed and those who viewed her as cursed. But Isla saw none of it. Her attention was fixed entirely on Alpha King Theron, who had risen from his throne and was staring at her with an expression she couldn't begin to interpret. His storm-gray eyes seemed to burn with inner fire, and she could smell something on the air, something wild and dangerous and utterly masculine. It was then that the ancient doors at the back of the hall burst open with a resounding crash. Through them bounded four magnificent wolves, their coats gleaming with unnatural luster, their eyes bright with intelligence and joy. Shadow, Frost, Ember, and Ash had found their way home. They raced through the stunned crowd, ignoring the screams and scrambling nobles, their attention focused solely on the Alpha, who stood frozen at the head of the hall. But as they approached the dais, something unexpected happened. Instead of going to their rightful master, all four wolves skidded to a halt before Isla. Shadow pressed his massive head against her hip while Frost and Ember flanked her protectively. Ash, the smallest with his distinctive silver markings, sat directly in front of her, his silver eyes locked on the crowd as his lips pulled back in a silent snarl. The message was unmistakable. These royal wolves, bred for generations to serve only the Alpha bloodline, had chosen a new master. They had chosen her. Isla looked up to meet Theron's gaze across the length of the hall, and in his storm-gray eyes, she saw the exact moment when everything changed. Recognition flared between them like lightning, accompanied by something deeper, something that made her breath catch and her heart race. The mate bond, ancient and undeniable, snapped into place between them with the force of destiny itself. Impossible, Seraphina breathed from her place beside the throne, her perfect composure finally cracking. But Theron seemed not to hear her. His voice when he spoke was rough with emotion and absolute authority. Clear the hall. Now. Chapter 5, Palace Shadows. 3 weeks had passed since Isla Ravencroft had been granted sanctuary within the walls of Silver Peak Palace, and she still felt like an intruder in a world of marble and moonlight. Her quarters were modest but comfortable. A small chamber in the eastern tower that housed the palace's healers and scholars, with a narrow window that overlooked the sprawling forest where this had all begun. She spent her days in the company of Master Aldrich, the ancient keeper of knowledge who had taken it upon himself to help her understand the magnitude of her abilities. His beard was silver as moonlight, and his pale amber eyes held depths of wisdom that spoke of centuries spent studying the old ways. "Concentrate, child," he instructed as Isla knelt beside a young squire who had broken his arm during sword training. The boy's arm was clearly fractured, the bone displaced in a way that made several onlookers turn away in disgust. Isla placed her hands gently over the break, closing her eyes and extending her senses as Aldrich had taught her. The familiar warmth began to build in her chest, spreading down through her arms like liquid moonlight. But now, instead of simply pouring her power into the wound, she took time to examine what she found there. The break was clean, thankfully, with no bone fragments that would complicate the healing. She could sense the boy's pain, sharp and immediate, but also his young body's natural desire to mend itself. Her gift simply accelerated what nature intended, guiding bone back to bone, encouraging torn muscle to knit together. The silver light that emanated from her palms was softer now, more controlled than it had been in those first desperate moments in the forest. Under Aldrich's guidance, she was learning to modulate her power, to heal without exhausting herself completely. When she opened her eyes, the squire was flexing his fingers with wonder, the arm that had been broken now whole and strong once more. "Blessed goddess," breathed one of the watching servants. "It's like witnessing miracles." Isla smiled gently at the boy, helping him to his feet. "How does it feel, Marcus?" "Perfect, my lady," the squire replied, his voice filled with awe. "It's as though it never happened at all." Word of Isla's abilities had spread through the palace like wildfire, despite the Alpha's attempts to keep the knowledge contained. Servants whispered of miracles in the corridors, and more than once Isla had been approached by those seeking healing for ailments both great and small. She helped where she could, always under Aldrich's careful supervision, but she was acutely aware of the division her presence was causing within the palace walls. Some saw her as a gift from the moon goddess, a healer sent in their hour of greatest need, with war threatening their borders and sickness spreading through the lower villages. Others viewed her with suspicion and fear, making signs against evil when she passed and muttering prayers against dark magic. And then there was Seraphina. The beta female had grown increasingly hostile toward Isla since that day in the Great Hall, her ice-blue eyes following the younger woman's movements with barely concealed hatred. Isla could feel the weight of that calculating gaze whenever they occupied the same space, and sometimes when Seraphina passed too close, Isla swore she caught the faintest trace of something acrid in the air, though she dismissed it as imagination. But it was Theron who occupied most of Isla's thoughts during the long hours of darkness. The Alpha had been scrupulously polite since granting her sanctuary, but Isla could feel the tension that crackled between them whenever they were in the same room. The mate bond that had flared to life between them in the great hall still pulsed with every heartbeat, a constant reminder of the connection neither of them dared acknowledge openly. He was bound to Serafina by the laws of pack and kingdom, married in a ceremony that had been witnessed by thousands. Isla was a commoner, a woman whose very existence threatened the political stability his reign depended upon. No matter what her heart might whisper in the darkness, she knew there could be no future between them. Still, she found herself watching for glimpses of him as she moved through the palace. She learned his routines, the times when he would cross the inner courtyard on his way to the training yards, the moments when he might appear in the corridor outside the library where she often studied with Aldrich. Shadow, Frost, Ember, and Ash had remained by her side throughout her time at the palace, their loyalty absolute and unwavering. They had grown even larger now, full-grown wolves of magnificent size, their intelligence continuing to develop in ways that amazed everyone who encountered them. They seemed to understand not just her words, but her emotions, offering comfort when her heart grew heavy and protection when she sensed danger. It was on a gray afternoon, with rain lashing against the palace windows, that Isla's careful peace was finally shattered. She was returning from the herb gardens, her basket filled with plants needed for the healing salves Aldrich had taught her to brew, when she noticed Shadow's hackles rising. The great charcoal wolf pressed close to her side, a low growl rumbling in his chest as his amber eyes fixed on something in the shadows ahead. Isla followed his gaze and felt her blood turn to ice. 3 figures stepped from the darkness of an alcove, their faces hidden by deep hoods, but their intentions clear from the gleam of steel in their hands. Now, one of them hissed, and they rushed forward with the coordinated precision of trained killers. Isla dropped her basket and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs as she heard the assassin's footsteps pounding behind her. Shadow, Frost, Ember, and Ash flanked her, their snarls echoing off the stone walls as they prepared to defend their chosen mistress with their lives. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before her, each doorway a potential trap, each shadow hiding possible enemies. Isla's mind raced as she tried to remember the palace's layout, searching for some route that might lead to safety. Behind her, she heard the distinctive sound of steel meeting claw as her wolves engaged the attackers. Shadow's roar of fury was answered by a man's scream of pain, but Isla didn't dare look back. She had to reach help, had to find someone who could. A figure stepped from the shadows directly in front of her, and Isla skidded to a halt, certain her death had finally found her. But instead of another assassin, she found herself face to face with Alpha King Theron himself. His storm-gray eyes took in the scene instantly, the sounds of battle behind her, the terror written across her features. Without a word, he swept her behind him, his body forming a protective barrier between her and the approaching danger. "Guards!" His voice boomed through the corridor, carrying the full weight of his alpha authority. "To me." The response was immediate. Armed men poured from every doorway, their weapons drawn and ready. The remaining assassins, seeing themselves outnumbered, attempted to flee, but they were cut down before they could reach the nearest exit. In the sudden silence that followed, Isla became aware of her body pressed against Theron's back. She could feel the tension in his powerful frame, could smell his scent, pine and leather and something indefinably masculine that made her head spin. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning to face her. His hands cupped her face with surprising gentleness, his dark eyes searching for any sign of injury. Isla shook her head, not trusting her voice. The mate bond between them was singing now, responding to his touch, to his protective instincts, to the way he was looking at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world. "The wolves?" Theron asked, his gaze moving to where Shadow was limping toward them, a shallow cut along his flank the only evidence of the battle. "They protected me," Isla whispered, finally finding her voice. "They saved my life." Theron's jaw tightened, his expression growing thunderous. "Someone will answer for this. I gave you my protection, and it was violated within my own walls." He turned to the scarred guard who had arrived with reinforcements. "Double the watch on Miss Ravencroft's quarters. I want to know who these men were and who sent them." As the guard began organizing his men, Theron drew Isla aside, his voice dropping to a tone meant for her ears alone. "I should have anticipated this," he said, his storm-gray eyes dark with self-recrimination. Your presence here has made you a target. There are those who see your abilities as a threat to the natural order. Isla looked up at him, seeing past the Alpha to the man beneath. You cannot protect me from the entire world, Your Majesty. I can try, he replied, and there was something in his voice, something raw and honest, that made Isla's breath catch. For a moment they stood there in the shadowed corridor, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, and Isla felt the full weight of what lay between them. The impossible attraction, the bond that pulled at her very soul, the future that could never be. Then Seraphina's voice cut through the moment like a blade through silk. How fortunate, the beta female said, her tone dripping with false concern as she approached with a rustle of fine fabrics. Another attack on our dear healer, just when my husband happens to be passing by to rescue her. Isla felt Theron stiffen beside her, saw the way his expression closed off as duty reasserted itself. Perhaps, Seraphina continued, her cold gaze fixed on Isla, it would be safer for everyone if Miss Ravencroft were relocated somewhere more secure. Somewhere away from the palace entirely. The threat was clear, wrapped though it was in honeyed words. Isla lifted her chin, meeting Seraphina's hostile stare with quiet dignity. I serve at the pleasure of the Alpha, she said carefully. If His Majesty believes I would be safer elsewhere, I will of course comply with his wishes. Theron was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes moving between his wife and the woman who had somehow claimed a piece of his soul. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Isla Ravencroft will remain under my protection within these walls. Any who seek to harm her will answer to me personally. It was both a promise and a warning, and Isla felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with her healing abilities and everything to do with the fierce protectiveness she heard in his voice. But as Seraphina's lips curved in a smile that never reached her eyes, Isla couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger had yet to reveal itself. Chapter 6, Web of Lies. The parchment crackled between Isla's trembling fingers as she read the damning words by flickering candlelight, hidden in the depths of Seraphina's private chambers. Surrounded by silk tapestries and golden ornaments, Isla felt like a thief stealing something far more precious than jewels. She was stealing truth. The letter, written in Seraphina's elegant script, was addressed to someone called Duke Malachar of the Northern Wastes, and its contents made Isla's blood run cold. The healer grows stronger each day, as does the Alpha's attachment to her. Our original timeline must be accelerated. When the Northern forces breach the eastern border as planned, ensure that the king's attention is fully occupied. I will handle the rest from within the palace walls. The Nightshade family has waited generations for this opportunity to claim the throne of Silverpeak. Soon, my lord, very soon. Isla's hand shook as she committed the letter to memory, memorizing every damning word. Around her, Seraphina's private study spoke of wealth and privilege, but now Isla could see the darker truth hidden beneath the beauty. Maps of Silverpeak's defenses lay spread across an ornate desk, marked with notes in the same elegant handwriting. Battle plans, weaknesses in the kingdom's borders, detailed information about troop movements. All of it ready to be passed to enemies who would use it to destroy everything Theron had worked to protect. The sound of approaching footsteps made Isla's heart leap into her throat. She quickly returned the letter to its hiding place within a false bottom of Seraphina's jewelry box and slipped behind the heavy velvet curtains that framed the chamber's tall windows. The door opened with a soft whisper of hinges, and Seraphina entered, her ice blue gown rustling with each graceful step. Even in the privacy of her own chambers, she maintained the perfect posture and composed expression of nobility. But Isla could see something else now, something she had missed before. There was a coldness in Seraphina's pale eyes, a calculating cruelty that spoke of someone capable of unspeakable acts. Seraphina moved to her writing desk and began composing another letter, her quill scratching across parchment with deliberate precision. Isla strained to see what she was writing, but the angle was wrong, the distance too great. A soft knock at the door interrupted Seraphina's work. "Enter," she called, her voice carrying the imperious tone she used with servants. The scarred guard stepped into the chamber, and Isla's breath caught in her throat. What was the Alpha's most trusted warrior doing here? Meeting secretly with the beta female. "Report," Seraphina commanded without looking up from her writing. "The healer grows suspicious," the guard said, his gravelly voice carrying an undertone Isla had never heard before. "She asks too many questions about palace security, about the guard rotations. She may have discovered something. Isla pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The scarred guard, the man Theron trusted above all others, was working with Serafina. Then we accelerate our timeline, Serafina replied, finally setting down her quill. Is everything prepared for tomorrow night? The men are in position. When the Alpha attends the War Council meeting, they will make their move. The healer will be taken to the dungeons and charged with treason. The evidence we've planted in her chambers will be discovered, and her guilt will be unquestionable. Isla's heart hammered against her ribs. They were going to frame her, make it appear as though she was the one betraying the kingdom to their enemies. With her reputation already suspect due to her magical abilities, many would be all too willing to believe such accusations. And the Alpha? Serafina asked, rising from her desk with fluid grace. Will be devastated by the betrayal of someone he trusted, the guard replied. In his grief and rage, he'll be more malleable, easier to manipulate. Your position as his sole confidant will be secured. Serafina smiled, and the expression was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Perfect. And if he proves difficult to control? The guard's hand moved to the hilt of his sword. Then the kingdom will mourn the loss of another Alpha to tragic circumstances. You will rule as regent until a suitable heir can be arranged. The casual way they discussed murdering Theron made Isla's stomach churn with rage and terror. This was not just political ambition. This was betrayal of the deepest kind, orchestrated by the very people Theron trusted most. There is one complication, the guard continued. The wolves. They remain loyal to the healer, and they're unnaturally intelligent. If we move against her, they'll try to protect her. Then ensure they're dealt with as well, Serafina said dismissively. Claim they attacked you in defense of their traitorous mistress. No one will question the death of dangerous beasts. Isla bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. Shadow, frost, ember, and ash, the magnificent creatures she had saved and grown to love, would be murdered simply for their loyalty to her. She had to warn Theron, had to find some way to expose the conspiracy before it was too late. But even as the thought formed, Isla realized the impossibility of her situation. Who would believe her accusations against the beta female and the captain of the guard? Her word as a common healer against that of nobility and established authority? The meeting concluded with the guard bowing stiffly to Serafina before departing. The beta female returned to her desk, humming softly as she continued her correspondence with the kingdom's enemies. Isla waited until she was certain Serafina was fully absorbed in her work before slipping from behind the curtains and making her way toward the door. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it would give her away, but Serafina remained focused on her treacherous letters. Just as Isla's hand touched the door handle, Serafina's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Going somewhere, dear Isla? Isla froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Slowly she turned to find Serafina watching her with those cold blue eyes, a knowing smile playing about her perfect lips. I was merely looking for you, my lady, Isla said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the terror coursing through her. Master Aldrich sent me to inquire about your headaches. He has prepared a new remedy. Serafina rose from her desk with predatory grace, moving closer to Isla like a cat stalking a mouse. How thoughtful. And tell me, did you find what you were looking for? The question was loaded with meaning, and Isla knew that her life hung in the balance of her next words. I'm afraid I don't understand, my lady. Oh, I think you understand perfectly. Serafina's smile never wavered, but Isla could see the deadly intent in her eyes. You see, dear, I know you've been watching me, following me, asking questions about my activities. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Isla's mind raced, searching for some escape, some way to salvage the situation. But Serafina continued speaking, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that made Isla's skin crawl. Poor little healer, so desperate to protect her precious Alpha, so willing to risk everything for a man who will never truly be hers. Serafina circled Isla like a predator, her silk gown whispering against the stone floor. You love him, don't you? That's what makes this so delicious. The mate bond. I can smell it on you both. It's quite pathetic, really, the way you moon after him, knowing he can never be yours. I serve the crown, Isla said carefully. Nothing more. Serafina laughed, the sound light and musical and utterly terrifying. Please, child, don't insult my intelligence. But it doesn't matter now, does it? Because you've served your purpose. Isla's composure finally cracked. At least I'm not betraying him to his enemies. The words hung in the air between them, and Isla immediately knew she had made a fatal mistake. Serafina's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too sharp for humanity. So you did find something interesting. How wonderful. She clapped her hands together like a delighted child. Guards! The door burst open, and armed men poured into the chamber. Not palace guards, Isla realized with growing horror, but soldiers bearing the dark insignia of the northern wastes. The enemy was already within the walls. Seize her, Serafina commanded. Our little spy has served her purpose. It's time for her to take her place in the dungeons, where she'll await trial for treason against the crown. Isla tried to run, but there were too many of them. Strong hands seized her arms, binding them with iron shackles that burned against her skin. She tried to call out, to scream for help, but a cloth was forced over her mouth, muffling her cries. As they dragged her from the chamber, Isla caught one last glimpse of Serafina, who was already returning to her desk to complete her letters to the kingdom's enemies. Give my regards to the rats, Serafina called sweetly. I'm sure you'll find the dungeons quite enlightening. The last thing Isla saw before they dragged her into the darkness was Serafina's cold smile, beautiful and terrible as a winter storm. In the depths of the palace, Shadow, Frost, Ember, and Ash lifted their heads in unison, their hackles rising as they sensed their mistress's distress. Their howls echoed through the stone corridors, a mournful sound that spoke of loyalty betrayed and love endangered. But it was already too late. The trap had been sprung, and Isla was caught in its merciless jaws. Chapter 7: Silver and Steel. The dungeons of Silver Peak Palace were carved from the living rock beneath the fortress, their walls weeping with moisture and centuries of accumulated despair. Isla had been thrown into the deepest cell, where the darkness was so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The iron shackles around her wrists had been forged with silver, burning her skin and somehow dampening the healing power that usually flowed so freely through her. She had lost track of time in this place where day and night meant nothing. Hours could have passed, or days. The only sounds were the distant dripping of water and the scurrying of rats through hidden passages in the stone. Isla pressed her back against the cold wall and tried to marshal her strength. The silver in her bonds was weakening her, but she could still feel the power deep within, like embers waiting to be fanned into flame. If she could focus, if she could overcome the pain. The silver light began as barely a flicker beneath her skin, growing stronger as she concentrated. The silver burned like fire where it touched her, but Isla gritted her teeth and pushed through the agony. The light spread from her heart down through her arms, and she felt the bonds begin to weaken, the metal growing brittle under the assault of her magical energy. With a sound like breaking bells, the shackles shattered, falling to the stone floor in pieces. Isla gasped, her wrists raw and bleeding, but free at last. The healing power surged through her, mending the worst of the damage, though she remained weak from the prolonged contact with silver. Above her, she could hear the sounds of battle. The clash of steel on steel, the shouting of men, the roar of creatures that didn't sound entirely human. Serafina's allies from the northern wastes had begun their assault on the palace. Isla made her way carefully through the dungeon corridors, her bare feet silent on the damp stone. She had to find Theron, had to warn him of the betrayal that surrounded him. But first, she needed to arm herself. The guard post at the entrance to the dungeons was empty, its occupants presumably called away to defend the palace above. Isla found a cloak to cover her torn dress, and a small dagger that would have to serve as her only weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The sounds of battle grew louder as she climbed the winding stairs that led from the dungeons to the main levels of the palace. She could smell smoke now, acrid and choking, and the orange glow of fire flickered against the walls. Isla emerged into chaos. The great hall was a war zone, with palace guards fighting desperately against invaders whose skin bore the pale blue tinge of northern frostlands. These were not entirely human, she realized with horror. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their movements held an inhuman fluidity that spoke of dark enhancements. Through the melee, she caught sight of a familiar charcoal shape moving with deadly purpose. Shadow was there, his massive form tearing through enemy soldiers with savage efficiency. Frost, Ember, and Ash fought beside him, their loyalty absolute even in the face of overwhelming odds. Shadow, Isla called out, and the great wolf's amber eyes found hers across the battlefield. Relief and joy flashed in his gaze, and he began fighting his way toward her, his powerful jaws crushing any enemy that stood in his path. A northern soldier noticed Isla's presence and turned toward her, his weapon raised and his enhanced features twisted with killing intent. Isla raised her small dagger, knowing it would be inadequate against his superior size and strength. But before he could reach her, Shadow was there, his massive body slamming into the soldier and bearing him to the ground. The wolf's jaws closed around the enemy's throat, and the threat was ended with brutal efficiency. "Where is the Alpha?" Isla asked, her hands buried in Shadow's thick fur. The wolf's eyes turned toward the upper levels of the palace, and Isla understood. Theron was fighting on multiple fronts, trying to defend his people and his home against enemies who had infiltrated his very household. Isla and her 4 protectors fought their way through the palace, following the sounds of the fiercest combat. They found Theron in the throne room, surrounded by the bodies of fallen enemies, his coal-black hair wild and his clothing torn. He moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior, his sword singing through the air as he held off wave after wave of attackers. But Isla could see that he was tiring. Even an alpha had limits, and he had been fighting for hours against overwhelming odds. Blood streaked his arms and face, and his breathing was labored. Worse, the scarred guard was there, fighting at Theron's side with apparent loyalty, while Isla knew the truth of his betrayal. She watched in horror as the guard maneuvered closer to the alpha, his sword raised as though to defend, but Isla could see the killing intent in his eyes. "Theron!" Isla screamed in warning, but her voice was lost in the din of battle. The guard's blade swept around in a deadly arc, aimed at Theron's unprotected back. The Alpha, trusting his captain implicitly, never saw the betrayal coming. Isla didn't think. She ran forward, pushing through the melee with desperate urgency. The healing power blazed through her like wildfire, and she reached out with both hands, silver light streaming from her fingers. The light struck the guard just as his blade was about to find its target. The treacherous captain screamed as the healing energy invaded his body, but instead of mending, it began to burn. Isla's power, twisted by her rage and desperate need to protect, became something else entirely, something that could destroy as well as heal. The guard's scream cut through the noise of battle as he crumpled to the floor, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. Around the throne room, the fighting paused as both sides stared in shock at what Isla had done. Theron turned, his storm-gray eyes wide with amazement and something deeper, relief, gratitude, and beneath it all, the mate bond that flared between them like lightning. But their moment of connection was shattered as Seraphina entered the throne room, flanked by her remaining soldiers. She had abandoned all pretense now, her beautiful face twisted with rage and ambition. Dark energy swirled around her like smoke, and Isla could see her true nature at last. Seraphina was no mere human noble. She was something else, something that had been hiding among them for years, waiting for this moment. "How touching," Seraphina purred, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made the air itself shiver. The little healer and her alpha, together at last. "It's almost romantic, if it weren't so pathetic." As she spoke, Seraphina began to change. Her flawless skin took on a pale blue tinge, and her silver blonde hair darkened to the color of storm clouds. Her fingernails lengthened into claws, and when she smiled, her teeth were sharp as razors. "You see, dear husband," she continued, her form continuing to shift and change, "you never married a human woman at all. You bound yourself to a frost demon, and through me, the northern wastes have had access to all your secrets, all your defenses, all your weaknesses." Theron's face went white with horror and rage. The marriage contract, it was signed before the moon goddess herself. "How is this possible?" Seraphina laughed, the sound like breaking ice. "Because I am not bound by your petty mortal laws. The Nightshade family has served the northern wastes for generations, and I am the culmination of centuries of careful breeding and planning. I am what happens when demon blood runs pure." The revelation hit Isla like a physical blow. All of Theron's pain, all of his loneliness within his own marriage, had been orchestrated by enemies who had infiltrated his very bed. "But enough talking," Seraphina said, raising her hands. Dark energy began to coalesce around her fingers, crackling with malevolent power. "It's time to end this farce and claim what is rightfully mine." She launched the attack at Theron, but Isla was faster. She threw herself between them, her own power blazing to life as she met darkness with light. The collision sent shockwaves through the throne room, shattering ancient stone and toppling pillars. Isla felt Seraphina's power trying to invade her mind, seeking to corrupt and destroy from within. But the healing light that was her gift proved stronger than the demon's malice. Where darkness touched light, it withered and burned away like frost before the sun. "Impossible," Seraphina snarled, her perfect composure finally cracking. "You're nothing but a human peasant with a minor healing gift." "She's my mate," Theron said, moving to stand beside Isla. His own power, the ancient authority of the Alpha bloodline, joined with hers, creating a barrier of pure force that made the demon step back. "And together, we are going to end your reign of lies." The final battle began in earnest then. Light against darkness, truth against deception, love against the corruption that had poisoned the kingdom of Silverpeak for far too long. Isla felt her power surge beyond anything she had ever experienced, amplified by the mate bond and by her desperate need to protect the man she loved. Beside her, Theron fought with the fury of an alpha betrayed, his sword cutting through frost soldiers as though they were made of mist. Shadow, frost, ember, and ash joined the battle, their loyalty absolute as they defended their chosen family against all enemies. But it was Isla's power that proved decisive. The healing light that flowed from her hands was no longer gentle and restorative. It was purifying fire, burning away the darkness that had infected her new home and threatening to consume anyone who stood against the rightful order. Seraphina's screams echoed through the palace as Isla's power stripped away her demonic enhancements, leaving her diminished and mortal once more. The northern soldiers, their connection to their mistress severed, began to flee or surrender. As dawn broke over the kingdom of Silverpeak, the battle was won. The palace was free, the enemies routed, and the traitors exposed. Isla stood in the ruins of the throne room, exhausted but victorious, her hand clasped tightly in Theron's as they surveyed the damage and began to plan for rebuilding. The mate bond between them pulsed with satisfaction and promise, no longer something to be denied or hidden, but embraced as the foundation of a new and better future for them all. Chapter 8. Dawn of the Silver Queen. 1 year later, the gardens of Silverpeak Palace bloomed with a beauty that had not been seen in generations. Where once there had been only practical herb beds and defensive barriers, now flowers of every color imaginable created a tapestry of natural wonder that drew visitors from across the known realms. Isla walked slowly through the pathways she had designed, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly where new life grew beneath her heart. The morning sun cast silver light across the healing academy that had been built where the old dungeons once stood. Young men and women from every corner of the kingdom came here to study under Isla's guidance, learning to channel the gifts the moon goddess had bestowed upon them. The sound of their laughter and earnest discussions drifted through the open windows, a symphony of hope that filled Isla's heart with contentment. "My queen," called a familiar voice, and Isla turned to see Master Aldrich approaching, his ancient face creased with a smile. In the years since the battle that had freed Silverpeak from Seraphina's deception, the elderly scholar had become like a grandfather to her. His wisdom and gentle humor were a constant source of comfort. "Master Aldrich," Isla replied, her own smile radiant as she embraced him. "How fare our newest students?" "Eager as spring colts and twice as energetic," he chuckled, his pale amber eyes twinkling with amusement. "Young Marcus managed to heal a broken wing on a sparrow this morning, though I suspect the bird was more frightened by his enthusiasm than grateful for the mending." Isla laughed, the sound carrying across the gardens like music. Marcus, the same squire whose arm she had healed in those first uncertain days, had discovered his own healing gift and now studied with passionate dedication. He was not alone. In the wake of the Northern Waste's defeat, it seemed as though the moon goddess had awakened dormant abilities throughout the kingdom, as if the darkness had been holding back a tide of light that now flowed freely. "And the border reports?" Isla asked, her expression growing more serious. Even in this time of peace and rebuilding, she remained acutely aware of the responsibilities that came with her position as Luna Queen. "Quiet as a monastery at midnight," Aldrich assured her. "The new watchtowers you designed have proven most effective, and the healing stations along the trade routes have created goodwill with neighboring kingdoms. Even the northern wastes have sent envoys seeking a formal peace treaty." Isla nodded, satisfaction warming her chest. The healing stations had been her idea. Places where travelers could receive aid regardless of their origin or ability to pay. It was a radical concept that had initially met with resistance from some of the more traditional nobles, but the results spoke for themselves. Trade had flourished, diplomatic relations had strengthened, and Silver Peak had become known throughout the realms as a beacon of compassion and wisdom. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Isla's attention, and her heart leaped as she recognized the distinctive rhythm of Theron's war horse. Even after a year of marriage, after countless nights spent in his arms and days working side by side to rebuild their kingdom, the sight of her mate still made her pulse quicken with desire and love. Theron rode into the garden courtyard with natural grace, his coal-black hair gleaming in the sunlight and his storm-gray eyes searching until they found her. The moment their gazes met, the mate bond that connected them sang with joy, a harmony that had only grown stronger with time and shared purpose. He dismounted in one fluid motion and strode toward her, his face lighting with the smile he reserved only for her. The formal court attire had been abandoned for simple leather and linen that showed off his powerful frame, and Isla felt her cheeks warm as she remembered their passionate farewell just that morning. "My love," Theron murmured as he reached her, his large hands coming up to cup her face with infinite tenderness. "How do you feel? The healer said you should rest more, especially now that—" Isla silenced him with a kiss that tasted of promise and homecoming, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed close to the solid warmth of his chest. When they broke apart, both were breathing heavily, and she could see the desire burning in his storm-gray eyes. "I feel perfect," she whispered against his lips. "Strong and healthy and ready to welcome our child into the world." Theron's hand moved to cover hers where it rested on her belly, his expression one of wonder and fierce protectiveness. "Our daughter will be the luckiest child in all the realms to have you as her mother." "Or son," Isla corrected with a teasing smile. "And he will be fortunate to have you as his father, my king." They stood together in the garden, surrounded by the beauty they had created and the life they had built from the ashes of betrayal and war. In the distance, Isla could hear the sound of shadow, frost, ember, and ash playing with the children from the village, their joyful barks mixing with childish laughter. The four wolves had grown even more magnificent in the past year, their loyalty absolute, and their intelligence continuing to amaze all who met them. "The council meeting went well?" Isla asked as they began walking toward the palace, her hand tucked securely in the crook of Theron's arm. "Better than expected," Theron replied, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "The trade agreements with the southern kingdoms have been finalized, and they've specifically requested access to our healing academies. It seems your reputation has spread even further than we imagined." Isla felt a familiar flutter of pride and responsibility. The academies had been her greatest achievement. Schools where those blessed with healing gifts could learn to use them safely and effectively. What had started as a single classroom had grown into a network spanning 5 kingdoms, with more being built every month. "And Serafina?" Isla asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. "Still imprisoned in the tower cell we prepared for her," Theron replied, his expression hardening slightly. "The enchantments hold her demonic nature in check, and she remains powerless. The council still debates her ultimate fate, but I confess I care little for the opinion of those who were not there to see her true nature revealed." Isla squeezed his arm gently. They had agreed that execution, though perhaps deserved, would make them no better than their enemies. Instead, Serafina spent her days in a cell that prevented her from accessing her supernatural abilities, aging slowly toward a natural death while contemplating the consequences of her choices. "She asked to see you again," Theron continued reluctantly. "I told the guards you were not to be disturbed, but she insisted the matter was urgent." Isla considered this as they climbed the steps to the palace's main entrance. In the months following the battle, Serafina had requested meetings with her several times, always claiming to have important information about remaining threats or hidden dangers. Each time, the conversations had revealed nothing but attempts to sow doubt and discord. "I'll see her," Isla decided, feeling Theron's immediate tension. "But not alone and not for long. If she truly has something important to share, we should hear it." Theron's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Very well. But I will be present, and we end the meeting the moment she shows even a hint of her old manipulation." They made their way through the palace corridors, past tapestries that now depicted scenes of healing and growth rather than conquest and war. Servants bowed respectfully as they passed, their faces bright with genuine affection for their rulers. Isla had insisted on treating the palace staff as valued members of their extended family, and the resulting loyalty and joy had transformed the very atmosphere of their home. The tower cell was in the highest part of the palace. Its single window offering a view of the kingdom Seraphina had tried so hard to claim. 2 guards stood at attention outside the door, their expressions professional but alert. "Your Majesties," one of them said, bowing deeply. "The prisoner has been quiet today. No unusual activity or requests." Theron nodded to the guards and opened the heavy door. Inside, Seraphina sat at a small table, her once perfect beauty now showing the effects of a year in captivity. Her silver blonde hair had grown dull, her flawless skin showed lines of age and bitterness, and her ice blue eyes held the hollow look of someone who had lost everything. But when she looked up at Isla, those eyes still held a spark of malicious intelligence. "How lovely," Seraphina said, her voice carrying only the faintest echo of its former musical quality. "The Luna Queen comes to visit the monster in her tower. How perfectly dramatic." "You requested this meeting," Isla replied calmly, taking the seat across from her former adversary. "Speak your piece." Seraphina's gaze moved to Isla's pregnant belly, and something ugly twisted her features. "So the rumors are true. The peasant healer carries the future of the bloodline." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "Tell me, do you ever wonder what your child will inherit from you? Your healing gifts perhaps, or something darker?" Isla felt Theron stiffen beside her, but she kept her expression neutral. "My child will inherit love, wisdom, and the strength to protect those who cannot protect themselves." "How beautifully naive," Seraphina laughed, but the sound was bitter and hollow. "You think your power is purely benevolent, don't you? That silver light that flows from your hands, bringing life and healing to all it touches." "It has brought nothing but good to this kingdom," Isla replied firmly. "Has it?" Seraphina's smile was sharp as a blade. "Tell me then, dear queen, what happened to the scarred guard? What became of those northern soldiers who felt the touch of your healing power turned weapon?" Isla's hands clenched in her lap, but she said nothing. Seraphina had struck at a source of guilt that Isla had carried for months. In the heat of battle, her power had indeed turned deadly, burning away corruption but also ending lives. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on her heart. "You felt it, didn't you?" Seraphina pressed, sensing weakness. "The moment when healing became destroying, when your gift revealed its true nature. Power, pure and simple, the ability to give life or take it away with equal ease." "That's enough," Theron said, his voice carrying the full weight of his alpha authority. "You will not torment my mate with your poison." But Seraphina wasn't finished. "Your child will inherit that power, little queen. And someday, when they're older and stronger than you ever dreamed of being, they'll have to make the same choice you made in that throne room. To heal or to harm, to save or to destroy. I wonder which they'll choose." Isla stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. "My child will choose love," she said firmly. "As I have chosen, as their father has chosen. They will learn that true strength comes not from the power to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when mercy is stronger than vengeance." She turned toward the door, but Seraphina's voice followed her one last time. "We shall see, Luna Queen. We shall see." As they left the tower and made their way back to their chambers, Theron pulled Isla close, his arms strong and protective around her shoulders. "She speaks only to cause pain," he murmured against her hair. "You know this." "I know," Isla replied, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Seraphina's words contained a grain of truth that would someday need to be faced. That evening, as Isla sat in the great hall teaching a group of young healers the finer points of bone mending, she felt a familiar presence watching her from the shadows. She looked up to see Shadow, now fully grown and magnificent, his amber eyes bright with intelligence and affection. The great charcoal wolf padded forward and laid his massive head in her lap, a gesture of love and loyalty that never failed to move her. Frost, Ember, and Ash joined him, their own distinctive markings now fully developed into patterns of breathtaking beauty. "You four," Isla said softly, stroking Shadow's thick fur. "Still protecting me after all this time." As if he understood her words, Shadow's tail wagged once, and Isla could swear she saw satisfaction in his ancient eyes. These wolves, born of magic and raised with love, had become living symbols of the transformation that had swept through Silver Peak. Where once there had been suspicion and fear, now there was acceptance and wonder. The future stretched before them like an uncharted map, full of promise and possibility. There would be challenges, Isla knew. Serafina's words had reminded her that power always came with difficult choices, and someday their child would indeed have to navigate the complex responsibility that came with extraordinary abilities. But as she looked around the hall at the faces of her students, young men and women who had come from across the realms to learn the healing arts, Isla felt only hope. They were building something beautiful here, something that would outlast any single generation. The kingdom of Silverpeak had been reborn in the light of love and sacrifice, and it would endure for generations to come, protected by the magic they had nurtured and the bonds they had forged. Isla smiled as she felt the baby move within her, a gentle reminder of the future growing beneath her heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve and protect and heal. But tonight, surrounded by those she loved most in the world, Luna Queen Isla Blackthorne was content.